Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and uncover how a catastrophic, chaotic shipwreck accidentally birthed one colony and miraculously saved another. When we look back at the early 17th century, the colonization of the New World was anything but certain. Honestly, it was an incredibly dangerous, high-stakes gamble. Today, we're going to explore an epic story of survival, disaster, and sheer, unbelievable luck that literally altered the trajectory of global history.
So, picture this. It's 1609, and the flagship of a massive relief fleet, the Sea Venture, simply vanishes into thin air during a devastating hurricane. That single missing ship perfectly intertwines the destinies of two famous locations, Jamestown, Virginia, and the island of Bermuda. But to really understand just how absolutely critical this lost ship was, we first have to understand why it was even out there in the first place.
Section 1. The Virginia Company's Ambition.
If we rapidly trace the timeline of this whole gamble, it starts with King James taking the throne in 1603, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Fast forward to 1606, he issues the first charter to the Virginia Company, and by 1607, Jamestown is founded. But let me be perfectly clear here. Jamestown was struggling. Badly. We're talking hostile native populations, massive food shortages, internal discord, you name it. By 1609, the entire project was teetering right on the brink of total failure, which prompted them to issue a second charter. Now, the sheer scale of the bureaucratic effort in this 1609 second charter is wild. It was designed to save the failing colony, and it wasn't just some simple piece of paper. It was a desperate, massive financial reorganization. The Virginia Company realized, hey, to keep Jamestown from completely collapsing, we need a vast influx of capital, supplies, and some really strict new leadership to whip things into shape.
The list of names on these pages is basically a who's who of 17th-century venture capitalists. You've got everyone from wealthy noblemen to everyday commoners pouring their money into this incredibly risky New World venture. They were funding what became known as the Third Supply. Actually, think of it more like a giant rescue mission. A massive relief fleet of 9 ships, over 600 colonists, and vital supplies intended to pull Jamestown back from the brink.
Section 2. The Sea Venture Shipwreck. This was the intended route of that rescue fleet. The ship sailed from southern England down to the Canary Islands, caught the trade winds west to the Caribbean, and then aimed north via the Gulf Stream toward Jamestown. It was a pretty well-established path, intentionally designed to keep them far south of the isolated, uninhabited island of Bermuda. But nature had other plans. On July 24, 1609, a massive hurricane completely scattered the 9 ships. Tragically, the flagship, the famous Sea Venture, was thrown completely off course, and this was the absolute worst ship to lose. It was carrying the most important cargo: the new Lieutenant Governor Sir Thomas Gates, Admiral Sir George Somers, and the bulk of the food intended for those starving colonists in Virginia. Taking on water, literally sinking, the Sea Venture miraculously managed to wedge itself onto the rocky reefs of Bermuda. Against all odds, this saved the lives of every single one of the 150 men, women, and children on board.
Section 3. An accidental island paradise.
Now, the contrast between these two locations at this exact moment in time is just shocking. Over in Jamestown, the colonists were suffering through devastating, bitter winters, facing constant native attacks, and resorting to eating dogs, mice, and, get this, even shoe leather just to survive. Meanwhile, the castaways in Bermuda, they stumbled into a mild climate, 0 native enemies, coastal waters just teeming with fish, and incredibly rich sources of food everywhere they looked. To put that abundance into perspective, think about this staggering number: 4,000. Bermuda was home to these large, plump birds called cahows. Because the island had no human inhabitants, these birds had absolutely 0 fear of men. None. They were actually drawn to the sailors' lanterns at night, which allowed the castaways to easily hunt 4,000 of these tasty birds with simple clubs in a single day. And the island wasn't entirely devoid of mammals either. Feral Spanish hogs were just roaming around Bermuda, likely left behind years earlier by Spanish mariners, acting as a kind of forward-thinking food stash in the event of future shipwrecks. For the stranded English, these hogs provided a bizarrely fortunate life-saving feast. So they were feasting on the very provisions meant for Jamestown, completely supplemented by this incredible natural bounty. But they weren't just kicking back on the beach the whole time. While stranded, their leader, Admiral Sir George Somers, had his crew row him all around the island to create a meticulous manuscript map of their accidental paradise. In his honor, the islands were actually later renamed the Somers Islands. But despite all this absolute abundance, They knew they had a critical mission to finish. They were the leaders of the Jamestown relief effort, after all.
Section 4. Saving starving Jamestown.
Now, you don't just build seaworthy ships out of thin air. Over the course of about 9 months, they went through this grueling, painstaking process. First, they salvaged whatever wreckage, timbers, and crucial iron bolts they could from the wedged Sea Venture. Second, they harvested the incredibly abundant local Bermuda cedar wood. Third, and this is true survival ingenuity, lacking traditional materials, they actually caulked the hulls using lime and oil rendered from local sea turtles.
It was an unbelievable engineering feat, all taking place right there on the sandy beach. Guided by the governor-elect and the admiral, they constructed 2 completely new vessels from scratch, the 80-ton Deliverance and the smaller 30-ton Patience. Finally, by May 10, 1610, they packed up the survivors, well, minus a couple who had passed away and a few mutineers who decided to hide in the woods, and they set sail for Virginia.
Which brings us to the massive, suspenseful question that must have been eating away at all of them. Would these newly built ships carrying 150 castaways and whatever limited supplies they could scrape together reach Virginia in time to actually save the struggling colonists they were sent to relieve nearly a year prior?
Well, when they finally sailed up the James River in late May 1610, the reality they found was heartbreaking. Only 60 emaciated survivors remained. That brutal winter they missed while safe in Bermuda became forever known in Jamestown as the starving time. Of the roughly 240 people who had been crowded into James Fort the previous November, over 75% had died from starvation, disease, and native attacks. The Bermuda survivors were completely horrified.
Section 5. 2 colonies intertwined. Jamestown was in such terrible, desperate shape that when Gates arrived, he literally ordered the colony to be abandoned. They boarded the ships and were sailing down the river to leave North America for good when, bam, they miraculously intercepted another incoming English supply fleet. So they turned right back around. The Bermuda castaways had effectively bridged the gap and kept the colony alive. Shortly after, survivors began publishing these thrilling, dramatic accounts of their shipwreck, like Sylvester Jourdain's pamphlet, and it caused an absolute runaway sensation back in England.
And this wild saga left a massive, lasting legacy. First off, one of those Sea Venture passengers was John Rolfe. He very likely brought high-quality tobacco seed from Bermuda to Virginia, successfully cultivated it, and totally saved Virginia's economy. Second, recognizing just how strategic and abundant Bermuda was, the Virginia Company sent the ship Plough to officially colonize the island in 1612. And finally, that epic, viral tale of survival generated so much hype and public excitement that it restored faith and much-needed investment back into the near-bankrupt Virginia Company.
Listen to this evocative quote from R. Rich's 1610 published ballad. It perfectly captures how deeply this miraculous survival grasped the public imagination over in London. People were just completely captivated by the idea that heaven was pilot in the storm, guiding that doomed ship safely to the shores of what they were then calling the Bermudas. And that brings us to an absolutely mind-blowing fact to wrap up with. This very survival story, the terrifying storm, the mysterious but providing island, the herring narrative published by William Strachey, it directly inspired William Shakespeare's 1611 masterpiece, The Tempest. Shakespeare even explicitly references the Bermudas right there in the play. This incredibly dramatic slice of history permeated global culture forever. So what I want you to take away from this explainer is a pretty profound question. How drastically different would the map of the modern world look today if the wind had blown just a few degrees differently on July 24th, 1609? Think about that until next time.